listening to Inclusive AF with Jackie Clayton and Katee Van Horn.
All right. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Katee Van Horn with the Inclusive AF podcast. I am solo today without my sweet friend Jackie because she is somewhere up in the air above the United States. I don't even know where at this point, but we have a very special guest that we are excited about. So Maria, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself and then we'll jump right in.
Thank you, Katee. Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Morukian. I use the pronoun she, her, and I'm the president of a small consulting business that is based in Washington, D.C., called MSM Global Consulting. And MSM Global's mission is really focused on organizational culture transformation, leadership development, with the lens around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our whole focus is on helping leaders at all levels of the organization really create sustainable change to build thriving organizations for everybody.
Awesome. Very cool. And DC, you're in DC today. So
yes.
How is the sky in DC?
It is much better today. We actually were able to, I was able to walk my kids to school without anyone wearing masks. So that was nice. But yeah, the last couple of days have been a little gross out there.
Yeah. Well, I hope that, we're in that season now of fires and hopefully we don't have too many of them. I'm in Arizona. And so, we always have to worry about our fires and then also California's fires. So hopefully we can have a calm summer and fall, and we'll go from there. But yeah, I saw some pictures from back east and it looked yucky. So glad it's clearing up.
Thank you.
So I want to jump right into my questions because I love this idea because I think I can't tell you how many organizations right now I'm talking to that are in the midst of some sort of transformation, change, how do we evolve and, really become a company of the future? So I would love to start off with how you got into this work, but then also kind of, how do you approach this work when you're working with a new organization?
Absolutely. So I've been in this space for about 20 years now. I started my career really first and foremost wanting to focus on this in more of a global setting, providing intercultural competence training for expats, for people who were going to be coming to the United States, really looking at it in terms of cultural identity factors. And once I started doing that work, I began to realize that there was so much nuance when we were talking about and training around cultural identity when it came to power, societal advantages, and oppression, and that if we're not having those conversations, we're really not doing anyone any justice. So in terms of being able to navigate these cultural differences. So that really was a strong changing point, I think, in my career and also my personal life as a white identifying cisgender woman doing this work, recognizing that there are also a lot of different lenses and blind spots that I was bringing with me into the learning space. So that transitioned into, I worked in the nonprofit world for quite some time, providing DEI leadership initiatives and training and facilitation for other nonprofits, education, healthcare, a lot of more sort of social oriented organizations, and then moved into the federal government. Living in DC, many of us spend some period of time working in and around government. Yeah. And so I joined the State Department. And I spent a number of years as a leadership development specialist and DEI practitioner internally at state. Then spent a little bit of time in a corporate consulting company, and then really just there was a calling for me, I think, to open up my own organization, really because I saw that there was an ever-present gap in this work. Mm-hmm. And the gap was really related to, and I think we see it nowadays, as well, and have many of us in the DEI field have been talking about this, that oftentimes DEI initiatives are really seen more from a training lens and even more so from a performative lens, whether that's intentional or not. really just scratching the surface. Let's throw some training at the problem and fix it. Or let's hire some more people who are underrepresented, and that will quote unquote fix the problem, rather than looking at this as a true systemic change process that takes time, that takes effort, that takes resources, and sometimes years to start to really move the needle. So that was something that I felt passionate about and really wanted to center my time, my effort, my work around. And so I've had MSM Global Consulting for almost 10 years now, and going strong. We've got a team of 4 now, full-time staff, plus a number of external facilitators, consultants, practitioners that support our efforts.
Awesome. That's so cool. I'm rereading Culture Map, and and I think it's one of those books that, as you think about the global view of cultures and how just the way people approach work and how different it is, and using the lens, like you said, your blind spots that you have coming into working with folks globally, it just is so fascinating to kind of think about the different approaches and just the ways that people work differently across the globe. So I love that you're focused on that and that you're thinking about that. When you were with the Department of State, I am going to make an assumption that you were working with some of the folks that were traveling overseas and developing some of those skills. So how was that?
Yes, it was really fascinating. We did work with both Americans serving overseas as well as their foreign national counterparts. And in addition to that, civil service folks who mostly were stationed in and around the domestic United States. So it was many interesting organizational dynamics in terms of, in any organizational culture, there's us and them, and people tend to gravitate toward, folks who are like them. And in addition to that being based on gender identity and age and racial identity, there were also some of these interesting cultural elements around us versus them related to what your job function was. Were you foreign service versus civil service versus locally engaged staff? And when we dug under the surface, a lot of what I started to see, especially in not only my facilitation, but my one-on-one coaching with leaders at all levels across state, was that there was often this explicit idea that, well, because I work overseas, because I've devoted my career to global and international diplomacy, check the box, I got this cultural competence thing. And then I would have conversations with the locally engaged staff, with the Foreign Service nationals, and they would say, yeah, not so much. Right. So there was definitely a divide. And, one of the things that always struck me from my conversations with the locally engaged staff was, we're the majority of the workforce in the embassy, and yet we are constantly being expected to assimilate to an American workplace. And we accept that when we join this organization, but we also see that there are some pretty strong disconnects. And when our American counterparts aren't being more intentional, trying to understand, we lose so much. We lose so much in terms of the richness of our relationships. And also we lose so much in terms of productivity and performance and relationship building. So it was really, I thought, incredibly powerful to be able to take those stories from the Foreign Service nationals and share that with the US officers, not to chide them or berate them, but just to say, you may not be aware of this, right? But it's aligning our good intentions with the impact that we have on others. And again, bringing in that power dynamic. Who is in a seat of power within this organizational structure, and how is that impacting and influencing your relationships and ultimately the outcomes you're getting from your colleagues, from your staff? So it was really fascinating to be able to bring not only that intercultural element, but also the DEI experience into the conversations with Foreign Service nationals.
And I think that's such a critical piece when we talk about inclusion. I think for so many years, inclusion really translated to assimilation. Mm-hmm. And, and unfortunately that has And I think that's still the issue, and even just like US based companies. But then you take on that global view, and it's even more, kind of diverse in the way that people are approaching things. So I like that you're talking about this, and I like that this is something that is highlighted. I think that, it's interesting. I just had a recent situation where I was talking to a senior leader, and we were talking about a all hands meeting that had occurred. And he was kind of commenting that one of the folks that spoke, who is originally from Germany, well, he's not a very good speaker. And I said, well, here's the thing. He is literally translating everything in his head before it comes out of his mouth. So it's in English. Wow. So, let's see what he's like when he's speaking in German. And, it's, his first language. And it was just an interesting conversation. And then, literally and 2 days later, we were in a meeting, and one of the women on the call was like, yeah, I'm messaging in Slack in German and talking to you all in English. And so, pardon me if I, start switching languages. Yeah. And it is one of those things, like even that basic language piece that, as we're talking to the foreign national folks, like if they're not in a English speaking country, we are expecting them to speak English, which, is not their first language, but also expecting them to get all of the nuances of our crazy English language.
Exactly.
I used the expression low hanging fruit the other day with some folks in Bulgaria, and they were like, what is that? And I was like, okay, sorry, give me a minute.
Yes.
It is those nuances that can really lead, and that's just the language piece alone. That's not talking even the cultural pieces and some of those other things that kind of come to mind. But I love that. So as you're working with an organization, when you first go into the organization, what is your approach to, kind of getting to know what those issues are, getting to know, the best way to approach it?
We always start with some layer of assessment, of data gathering, because we need to understand the landscape and the existing culture, and also to be able to dive deeper into how different individuals representing different identity groups are experiencing that culture. A lot of times what I found is that we'll have the initial call with somebody in human resources or in senior leadership, and their perspective and how they describe the organization and the challenges it faces may or may not always be aligned with how others are experiencing the organization. And so we will, we'll take that data, but then we'll also say we need to do a survey. Ideally, we want to do some individual conversations and focus groups. Some of the most powerful focus groups that we've done have been dialogues where we've created affinity spaces for people, whether that is Black, Indigenous people of color, whether it is women, whether it is LGBTQ plus folks, or whatever is needed in order to gather insights from folks who perhaps are part of an identity group that is either in the minority or has had a different experience. And sometimes that's related to how long they've been with the organization. We have one organization that we've been working with where we had an affinity dialogue group for people who have been with the company for 5 years or less, because they said, it's so interesting. Every place else I've worked, after about 6 months, you're sort of like, you're in. Mm-hmm. But here, 3 years in, you're still being called a newbie. You're still not being given those opportunities to show your abilities because you don't yet have enough. And I think actually the leader of this organization actually referred to it as you haven't earned your stripes yet. So again, these very interesting, not so subtle cultural norms that can have a significant impact on whose voice is valued, who has opportunities for growth and mobility, and so on and so forth. So once we do that information gathering, then we'll look for themes, especially if there are some of those demographic variances, and then share that with the leadership, along with our recommendations. Here's, based on what we have heard and seen and what we know works within organizations like yours that are experiencing these same challenges, this is what we think you need. I don't know if this has been your experience, Katee, but oftentimes there's when we present those findings, it's a little bit of a gut check for the folks in senior leadership positions because they may not have been aware of either those gaps or challenges or the level to which those gaps and challenges are really getting in the way of people feeling included, feeling engaged, feeling like they can bring their full selves to work. So sometimes you have to deal with a little bit of defensiveness.
Oh, yes.
Deflection. I've dealt with a lot of intellectual deflection from people saying, well, I'm very data driven and like, well, here's the data.
Absolutely.
So that's always kind of the starting point. And then that also gives us information about how ready is the organization, especially at the leadership level, to do the work that's really required. Because we don't want to be a part of an initiative that is going to be window dressing, that isn't going to, if we're coming in and, just by coming in and being the consultant, we feel like we're making a contract, not only with the client, with the leadership, but we're making a contract of trust with the employees by asking them these questions, by stating these recommendations. And so if the organization is not committed to being in this for the long haul, then we feel like we're not doing our due diligence. We're not holding that trust for the employees. So that's something that we take very seriously before we even decide if we're going to move forward and continue our partnership.
I'm so happy to hear that. And I think it's good for our listeners to hear it as well, because I think this is one of the challenges that I have noticed. I have, some leaders that are like, oh, can I sit in on the listening sessions or the feedback sessions? Or HR folks are like, I want to sit in on the feedback sessions. And I tell them no. And it is because, I am an outsider. I don't know who these folks are. I don't have, maybe some bias or some other thoughts that might cloud what I'm hearing from them. And so it is always interesting to me to come in with that fresh set of eyes. And to your point, so many times you're bringing stuff back to the leadership team that they're like, well, that wasn't my experience. And you're like, right? I'm sure it wasn't.
Yeah.
So it's always good to hear. And, yes, it's anecdotal information and you're not, you're hopefully speaking to a certain percentage of the group, but it is so fascinating to hear what the experience is for folks that are coming in a, frontline role or a junior role, like the example you just gave of, hey, I've been here for 3 years, but I'm still considered a newbie. And, and what that kind of stigma like puts on a person. And for me, it's always tying back also to business results. So here's why this is an issue, but here's the impact as well. So it's always fascinating to have those conversations. I like that. When you are working with organizations, are there certain things that you have seen recently? Are there certain things that have popped that maybe are different than what they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Are there certain topics that are more front of mind for folks when you're having those conversations and those, feedback sessions, listening sessions, whatever you want to call them?
I definitely think that there is much more openness and willingness to explore race and racial injustice at a deeper level than I've ever seen before. And that's really exciting and encouraging to me. Really, I mean, it's unfortunate that came about because of the killings of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so many others. It's just the list goes on and on. But I do see the aperture has opened. And at the same time, I think what is equally present is the fear around the politicization of DEI initiatives, with the sort of the backlash and the anti-woke movement. And so there's a great deal of heightened anxiety around how do we make sure that we're quote unquote doing this right?
Right.
And I don't want to say or do the wrong thing. I'm afraid of being seen as political if I make a statement. And that's something that I'm sure has existed before, but I didn't see it as much as I'm seeing now. And I think that's just indicative of where we are as a society. We're so incredibly polarized. And because, even the idea and the concept of diversity, equity, inclusion has been misconstrued intentionally to make it feel as though it's divisive and it's inequitable and it's exclusionary, when it's actually, it's the opposite of all of those things. I also see, I think, an increasing awareness that just coming in and doing like a 1-hour presentation on unconscious bias is not enough. And yes, absolutely, we still get those calls. Yeah. but increasingly, I am seeing some patterns and trends as organizational leaders are realizing, wow, we've got, the existing workforce, especially the newer members of the workforce, the future leaders of all of our industries are coming in with a heightened level of exposure to and understanding of and acceptance of differences, and a desire to see their organizations, really a demand to see their organizations take a social stand, be more progressive. And so I think there still is a lot of grittiness around that. There's still a lot of digging in the heels, because that sort of status quo bias to just kind of keep going back to the way things have always been is hard to let go of. But there is, in my mind, a slowly evolving and increasing realization from people at the top levels of their organizations that if we don't take this and do it in a meaningful way, we are not going to be viable employers of choice. We're not going to be viable vendors. We're going to lose out ultimately on major corners of the consumer market. Even just, it's Pride Month, right? And so even just thinking about the LGBTQIA plus community and what we've seen in the news just in the last, couple of weeks and months around some of these major retailers walking back their commitments to the LGBTQIA plus community, which is so short-sighted, especially from a bottom line vantage point, because that community is the largest growing minority population in the country. It's got like over $1.4 trillion spending power. I mean, it's insane to me when you talk about the bottom line, right? And the business case for DEI, that organizational leaders continue to cave to these pressures to not be political, when in reality, what they're doing is just shooting themselves in the foot.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think that's the part that's kind of where I was going to go next. And so thank you kind of for opening this door, because I think that's one of the pieces that, to your point, is very short-sighted. So, as a consultant, as someone that is, people call to say, what should we do in this, and I'm sure you get those calls all the time. Hey, this just happened. How should we respond to it? What are your thoughts, and what's your advice to companies that are facing that backlash, that are getting anti-woke messaging, or whatever you want to call it, which I can't even stand that phrase, it's so dumb. But what is your advice to those organizations that are facing that kind of the political weaponizing, whatever you want to call it, of this work?
So 3 things immediately come to mind. One is, if you are going to step forth in your commitments as, in terms of allyship, and take a stand for this social progress, whether we're talking about Black Lives Matter, whether we're talking about, gender equality, pride, so on and so forth. One, just expect the backlash. This should not be a surprise to anybody at this point in time. And you better have a really good crisis comms team with some DEI experts on there who can prepare that messaging in advance and prepare the leadership to be able to get out there and stand strong in their messaging and their why. Always tying it back to mission, vision, values, what our company stands for, and why this is so important. 2, don't back down. The backtracking actually leads to such an erosion of trust that it can be much more damaging than standing strong. And oftentimes, for those companies that have stood strong and said, we're just going to ignore the haters and just keep our communications and our messaging focused on why this is valuable, why it's important, and that we stand by it, then those voices go away. They go and find somebody else to attack eventually. And three, I think it is focus on long-term outcomes rather than these short-term reactive fixes or backtracks. Again, thinking about the consumer buying power, the long-term focus on being an employer of choice for the future generations, holding on to that, and also for leaders to make sure that they have those numbers that they've done, that they've calculated those metrics, so that they can share that with their boards, so that they can share that with their shareholders or whoever their donors, if it's a nonprofit organization. But be ready to make that case for why these long-term outcomes are going to require us to stand strong now in this area.
Well, I think it goes back for me. First of all, those are all, I love all three of those. What it goes back for me is also what side of history do you want to be on? And I think that's one of the things that, I worked for one of the large retailers that is getting quite a bit of backlash right now. And I'm talking to my friends that are still there, and that erosion of trust that has occurred in the last, month or so. That's the part, you mentioned kind of that employer of choice of the future. And I think we're going to see some hiccups in that, in that lane, that, that area, because of the fact that, you were this employer that everyone knew it was safe, and that you had the backs of folks that were in these marginalized groups. And do you really, though? And so I think that's the piece that is interesting to me. And it is interesting that, companies that have been very much upfront and visible in these conversations, that they are stepping back now. And it's unfortunate, because it like you said, it's you might see a dip in sales for the next few months, but then people move on to something else. And I just think it's unfortunate that people can't see that long term at times when you're in the thick of it, which I think all of us have been guilty of, where you're facing the scariness of, oh my gosh, we're in trouble, and everyone's all over social media, and everyone's all talking about us in not a great way. Now what? So I love the three ideas, because I think having that crisis management team that's able to say, here's what you say when this happens, or here's how you respond. All of that is just so critical. And, I think for anyone that's in HR that has dealt with a reduction in force, and obviously that's very, very much front of mind for HR folks right now. But you sit down and you put together a FAQ. You sit down and say, what if this happens? You sit down and you have the what's the worst that could happen process for that very reason, so that you can go, how do we make sure that we are prepared for anything that might come from this conversation or, this action? So I love those ideas, and they can really be applied in this, but in so many other areas as well. So thank you for sharing those. So if you are, if you're working with a leadership team that is facing these types of changes, or just changes overall, I think, again, so many companies are in this transformation, or how do we do this differently? How do you think about the future of work? How do you think about, some of these pieces as well, that people that are looking for roles now aren't just focused on, what are the results? What are they, what do we see on the ticker, on the bottom of the screen or whatever. So how do you think about that?
One of the things that I've been incorporating into my training and my coaching with leaders and executives is, so Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy, who are authors and academics at Harvard Business School, wrote a book called Immunity to Change. And it's such a simple idea, but I think it's really powerful, that all of us tend to, especially when we are experiencing or trying to initiate major change, we have our stated commitments, right? This is what I intentionally and I explicitly want to do. This is the outcome I'm driving toward. Then looking at taking a step back and asking, well, what are the actions that I'm taking that might actually be getting in my way of that success? Or what are the things I'm not doing that might be getting in the way of this thing that I say I want? Why is that, right? So being able to dive down and discover what some of those hidden competing commitments are. Not because we're bad people or because we are ignorant, but simply because we have certain patterns, and whether that's patterns of behaviors or cultural norms that have been a part of just the way things are for so long that sometimes it's hard for us to let go of them. And they're often based on something that has given us some kind of reward in the past, or at least led us to feel sort of safe, and there was a level of certainty to it. And there's often some underlying assumptions that we need to raise to the surface and explore and test and say, okay, so if this is what we state that we really want, what do we need to either start doing differently or stop doing because it's getting in our way? And I think we need to address that with leaders at both the institutional level, but also at the individual level. The biggest thing that I see is needed when it comes to true DEI transformation, actually two things. One is it's got to start with leaders, and it has to start at the internal level. They need to realize, because positions of such power, whether they feel that power or not, that they have the most work often that needs to be done to shift that culture. And two, in order to track those changes, we need to have some sense of what are the outcomes that we are trying to achieve. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen with organizations trying to measure progress is that they focus on outputs, activities, events, trainings, heritage months, creating a DEI committee, so on and so forth. But what are the outcomes that you're driving toward? And how would you know that you're making progress towards them? So I think focusing on that immunity to change and what we're doing or not doing that's getting in our way helps us to discover what are the outcomes we're really trying to achieve and how do we get there? And so those are the things that I think are really important for leaders at this point in time to struggle with a little bit. This work is hard, it's ongoing. This is not something that is going to be done in a year, 2 years, 5 years. This needs to be seen as a critical strategic framework for the success of any organization, regardless of its mission.
I love that. And I think, of all the things you just said, I think one of the things that just really struck me is I've seen, and Jackie will tell you, she's not a huge fan of like employee resource groups. She's not been shy about that on this podcast or out, when we've been talking to friends, whatnot. And I think part of that is because it does feel like performative, just action to see action, but what is that actually doing to impact folks? How is that actually making a difference to the organization, to the structure, all of those things? And so I think looking at the measurements and what those measurements should be, can be, because I agree with you wholeheartedly. A lot of it is, what's our demographic information? How has that changed? And I think you probably get this question, what should we be, what metrics should we be tracking? What should we be looking at? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a challenge for folks at times. So when you're working with an organization, what are some of the metrics that you think are critical to be looking at, obviously, aside from basic demographic info?
Yeah. So in addition to representation, I always push my clients to look at representation of diversity at every level and within every job function. Mm-hmm. Overwhelmingly, what we have seen, especially in the last few years, is that there has been, in many instances, an increase in representation of people of color, for example. And yet it's often that population tends to be at entry-level positions. Mm-hmm. And they're often, especially as you were saying earlier, in terms of reduction of force, as many organizations have been contracting due to economic financial issues, they're the first people cut. Mm-hmm. So that also erodes trust in the organization. So I think looking at this in terms of how are we recruiting at all levels, how are we building that pipeline for success and succession plan so that we know that not only this year or next year, but 10 years down the road, we are going to have the type of workforce that is truly reflective of our society. In terms of measuring equity and inclusion, I think it's actually much, I don't want to say it's much easier than people give it credit for, but we all know what it feels like to be a part of an organization where we feel that sense of home, of familiarity, of belonging, where we feel valued. And there are questions that we can ask that help us gauge who feels that, right? Do you feel visible? Do you feel like you can be your full self when you come into the workplace? Do you feel like your opinions are valued? Do you feel that sense of belonging? Do you have adequate input into decisions that are going to impact you, so on and so forth. In terms of equity, we can look at policies and see who are they serving, who are they centered around, who might be missing, whether that is related to folks' religious needs, whether it's related to new parents, whether it's related to people who are caring for elders. We've already seen a lot of those changes happen in terms of our HR policies. And I think just continuing to identify what those best practices are, and then taking it one step further, and being proactive, not just doing the bare minimum, right? But I do think that there are ways for us to measure this. It really comes down to, again, asking ourselves, what are the outcomes that we're trying to drive toward? And what would be the measures along the way that would tell us that we're making progress? And it doesn't mean that we can't be measuring outputs, but I also think it's measuring the quality versus the quantity of those outputs. So if you're saying, well, we're doing this series of training programs around DEI for for all of our workforce, great. What are they learning? How are you measuring behavior change? Are you doing, especially doing 360s at the leadership and management levels and with specific competencies related to DEI? So that's measurement. We can see, are people saying that they're seeing a change in how their supervisors are engaging with them and others? So I think that there's a lot of different ways in which we can measure that. It does require some effort. It requires resources, and it requires either hiring external expertise to come in and do that work, or hiring somebody internally to do that work with that expertise. And that's the last thing that I think is often missing. There are a lot of people out there who bring a deep amount of commitment and passion and desire to do this work, but don't have the skills yet to be able to do it in that nuanced way. And that can sometimes, it sets them up to fail when we put them into positions that they don't have the resources or the skills to be able to deliver on. And we actually it can lead to some negative consequences for the organization in terms of its DEI efforts. So I really think that we need to be focusing more on providing the appropriate skills and resources for people who do want to become DEI practitioners to understand what it really takes to do this work in a meaningful way, to embed it in the organizational structure and culture, and to go beyond the performative that we were talking about.
Absolutely. And I think, we saw this, happen quite a bit right around that 2021 timeframe where folks were putting out their shingle of, hey, I'm a DEI consultant, and I cannot tell you the amount of companies that I got calls from or emails from of, hey, we brought this person in, they broke all the things. And it is that, luckily they are still reaching out and still trying to make a change, because I've also seen companies, hey, we tried this, it didn't work, so we're just not going to talk about it anymore. And I think that critical piece of working with folks that actually have done this, and that's not to say that new consultants coming out can't do this work. It's more just making sure they have the skill set to understand what are those nuances, what are those cultural things, what are the pieces. And so for anyone that is, just starting out, I I always like to speak to new consultants that are coming into this space, just to, give them cautionary tales, but then also give them, here are some things you really want to keep in mind at all times. And I think it's also, and we all know this is hard. It's really, really hard work. And the patience and the heaviness and all of these things that you're dealing with it's really critical to make sure that you are thinking about all of that and building your network of folks that you can reach out to in those times when you're like, why did I decide to do this? What was I thinking? But I think those are some of the things too. So I love that you're bringing that up. But I think the challenge and the work, it's so worth it when we can see, the work that we're doing actually start to have outcomes. And I'm going to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, a test. And, I think that's something that so many folks think they have to make these grand changes and, do these, big blow up. Hey, we're going to, blow up the whole thing. But I think those tests, those pilots, those small tweaks can make such a huge difference in the long term. And yes, it can be, hey, let's take all the managers through a bias training as one step. That's not the step. It's one step. And, and it's how do you build on that? Because it can't be a one and done conversation. I actually do I facilitate a workshop, and one of the lines that I say, and I think most of us do say this, I cannot cure you of your bias in this 2 hours. Sorry, I wish I could. Can't fix mine either. It's just there. And so I think that's great that, you bring those things up, because I think that's something that is a challenge for folks of wanting to get it done and get it done quickly. And this isn't a sprint. This is absolutely a marathon.
Absolutely. And I love what you said too about that. This is hard work, and we do need to find ways to build community so folks don't feel so isolated and don't get burnt out, because even the most highly skilled DEI practitioners have those moments where it's like, I can't do this anymore, right? If we lose that spark, it's really hard to gain it back. And so I think we really have to focus on being there for each other in whatever way, shape, or form that takes. But the fatigue is real. Absolutely.
For sure. So I would love to sit and just chat with you for more hours, because I love this conversation, but would love for you to share, what's one thing or one or two things that you want to make sure our listeners hear, so the leaders and the HR practitioners that are listening to the episode, what would you like them to hear from this?
I think going back to that just recent conversation that we were having around the fatigue and how challenging this work is that all of us who are invested in this, whether it's as formal practitioners or informally, we need to do our own work. And we can't just do it once. It needs to be something that we're constantly revisiting. Whatever identities I bring with me into the spaces, I have my own internal processing and reflection that I need to do about my, like you said, my biases, as well as just my lived experiences and how those are shaping my perceptions and my interpretations of today. All of us, I think, have an immense amount of work, and this feels to me like my personal sort of obligation to our society to find ways to build connections, because we are so polarized. And that also requires an immense amount of effort, mental, physical, emotional, but to be able to suspend my own judgments of people who don't see the world the same way I do, who perhaps are not at the same stage of this journey that I'm at. It's very easy for me to become impatient and lose my curiosity. And so that's something that I think all of us need to be really reflecting and working on. I wrote a book, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for Trainers, Fostering DEI in the Workplace. And that was actually, I devoted a whole chapter to, we need to start with us. Before we can get out there and be working with others, we really need to know what we're bringing with us into these spaces.
Absolutely. I think, it is very hard. to not center yourself in any conversation, but especially in this conversation when you do see so many different challenges, that folks are going through, and some of them you can relate to, some of them you can't, but keeping the work centered on the folks that you're working with is such a critical piece. So thank you for calling that out. For me, I think that I'm going to go back to, something that you said a little bit earlier. The leaders need to be involved in this conversation, and not just from a face of the conversation, but also resources. And, Jackie and I talk quite often about, you actually have you need to have a budget for this. And we know that a lot of companies have dropped this, dropped DEI as a budget line item because it's, hey, we have other things to focus on, or, hey, politics, all of these other pieces. And I think, to your point, it's even more critical now because of all the polarization that's going on. So for those of you who are practitioners doing this work, please keep your head up. And, I want to reiterate, find your network. And, I will, not to put words in your mouth, Maria, reach out to Maria or myself if you need to talk. But also, make sure that you just have those folks that you can step away from the work and decompress with. Because I think that's just another critical piece to this is making sure that you're, as you said earlier, looking at yourself and making sure you're okay, but then also making sure you're continuing to learn along this journey. So, Maria, thank you. Totally appreciate this conversation. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me. And we'll, definitely share this out with our folks. This is Katee Van Horn. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.